Dear students, in this module, we will be focusing on the various criticisms on the second demographic transition theory. The first section discusses criticisms that are common to the first and second demographic transition, and the second one discusses criticisms which are specific to the second demographic transition. Let's discuss about various theories or generalizations. In the context of demographic transition, it was initially understood that it should be a theory, but a debate is, are they theories or generalizations? Earlier scholars, as Landry discussed, in terms of what seemed like a theory. In contrast, Notenstein, Leschage and Van Dyke attempted to understand and relate their observations to each other within a larger analytical framework. In 1959, the first demographic transition, which is considered to be a generalization rather than a theory, as it was only relevant to the modern era, there were no clearly defined factors regarding future population growth. The second demographic transition may have been viewed along similar lines. Let's discuss focus on fertility. As a demographic transition, the major ideas are that it is criticized for primary focus on fertility with less defined relationships on mortality and migration. It is seen in the literature on different countries, focus on fertility and family formation, less discussion of migration and fertility. Caldwell also refers to fertility transitions rather than demographic transition, as the latter is more comprehensive. The universality of the transitions were also debated, whether the transition ideas are universal in nature. The argument was the universal theories that do not consider the uniqueness of each society's path of transition and adaptation are not very helpful. Also, some of the things which are suggested were mainly include accounting for country-wise or regional variations, also the different responses to particular ideas or practices that populations with diverse cultural assets at different points of time and with the different levels of socio-economic development may have. Accordingly, completely converging to a singular particular path is not very likely to happen. With regard to the second demographic transition, whether it is a transition, the argument was it may not be as significant as the first demographic transition. Further, the arguments regarding ideas as powerful to shape human behavior when considering the second demographic transition, although strength to change a demographic system is doubted, the role of structural factors is also to be accounted for. According to Caldwell, broadening the second demographic transition to include the first demographic transition would work better. With regard to secondary changes, the changes that are observed in the realms of sexual relations and living arrangements, but population changes have been occurring generally, therefore, new living arrangements may not be so much a transition. If it is, may be considered fourth or fifth, as many things happened before it and patterns described in the second demographic transition were already well underway. Therefore, changes can be seen to be a continuation of the first demographic transition of the forces underlying it. Further, the changes in patterns, like ideological or cultural, supposed to underlie the second demographic transition, and they are supposed to be the same. Other aspect is driving the initial stages of family planning and the values that led to low fertility rates in the 19th century in increasingly literate societies, where scientific thinking concerning health and disease were ongoing or had prior development. Values such as individualization are also seen to be part of the ongoing process, and research has been seen to play a role in influencing these trends. Also ongoing in Europe region is the breakdown. While Europe, some features of the second demographic transition were already been in existence even before the first demographic transition, and the second demographic transition cannot be imposed upon these systems easily. Coleman notes that aside from these, the whole package of features which the second demographic transition encapsulates has not been apparent anywhere before the late 20th century. To these arguments, Leschage responded that the true transitions are very different both in terms of the predictions as well as the motivating factors that underlie it. Explanation is that the secondary demographic transition predicts on a general level below replacement fertility levels, together with varied living arrangements, household formation and migration across the world. While the first demographic transition predicted more equilibrium outcomes such as stationary population, the second demographic transition sees more uncertainty in that below replacement fertility will increase population aging and affects welfare systems over long periods of time, which will in turn increase replacement migration to address labor force shortages. Also, we need to understand that the living arrangements in the second demographic transition, which is expected to be less than suitable for encouraging socialization and procreation, and the dissolving of unions will also impact fertility. According to Lesh, they none are secondary phenomena. Responding to the point of cohesiveness, in this regard, he also points out that multiple varieties of secondary demographic transition features have come into existence, mixes in the timing and variations in the spatial patterns of cohabitation and postponement of fertility. The second demographic transition values are close to a package with regard to effects on postponement of parenthood, but not in terms of recuperation. He adds that at a later stage of the life cycle, in terms of fertility levels in later life, greater gender symmetry and more developed services aimed at reducing opportunity costs of working women seem to be linked to greater catching up of fertility and consequently to the higher period fertility levels. Let's discuss about the term transition. In this second demographic transition, as not really a transition like the first one, not enduring long-term nature that most in a population share involving a movement from one sustainable pattern of demography to another, being a complete and not reversible. Further, it also highly varied behaviors, even in countries that most favor the transition. Examples in this regard can be cited. For instance, in some countries, more than half are extramarital births and possibly near universal cohabitation before marriage in Scandinavian countries, although marriage has not been left altogether. Further, the end of marriage in most modern societies continue to be through the death of a spouse rather than divorce. On the other hand, Coleman points out in the most developed countries, first demographic transition is close to completion. Most families having under 2 children, life expectancy of 60 years, the population growth is largely stagnant without considering migration, expected to remain as such. But rising the second demographic transition behaviors, even in regions such as Southern Europe and countries in Asia, where change seems most difficult, although still confined to particular regions. Examples in this context can be referred to populations in Asia with significantly reduced vital rates. Cohabitation and extramarital births are not common or easily accepted, although there may be reduced early marriage and higher propensities for females to remain unmarried in some urban cities. Some may have had traditionally higher rates of divorce. According to Coleman, these differences are all presented as if the populations are moving towards a particular common destination at varied speeds, which may be true, but it is not completed. In this regard, examples can be cited from the West. Populations as Asian immigrants and Muslims have been resistant to these behaviors, seen in arranged marriages to those from countries of origin, and some of the younger generations of Muslims in solidarity to what Coleman considers a more traditional form of Islam. He argues these are not the path of the second demographic transition. Also argued is that the second demographic transition features were halting or even declining in some populations by the end of the 1990s, such that the trends are not showing a way that all marriages are ending in divorce or that the total divorce rate will be past 1. Divorce is also no longer increasing speedily in some populations, possibly due to few who married in recent decades, of marriage rates on the rise in some countries, possibly influenced by delays in marriage. In this context, it is also important when we are discussing about second demographic transition, the issues related to gender. The second demographic transition also criticized for not including gender issues within its cultural context. Important points in this regard are: improvement in women's status may have played a significant role in bringing about changes in the demographic system, and that autonomy, self-realization, and the shift from a more bourgeois family model to a modern and individualistic model, which is central to the second demographic transition, have a more revolutionary impact for women than men. Further, analysis of gender equality amongst different types of social institutions is needed, given asymmetric gender relations in almost all societies. In this regard, some of the examples are given mainly from Europe. Men partake in fewer domestic tasks with women than men partake in economic tasks with men, which has contributed to the rise in divorce and cohabitation, an important feature of the second demographic transition. And while women are increasingly appearing in educational institutions in some countries, in familial institutions, the need remains that domestic and economic responsibilities are to be increasingly shared between men and women, such that partnership and parenthood become stronger, more positive options for both. There should be a mention here with regard to specific end states. The second demographic transition also does not indicate an end and beginning a point of the transition, lack of a measure that could indicate when the transition has begun. Further, measuring the beginning of the transition is a complex problem, as the concept focuses on whole shifts rather than on a single index of measurement. The end state for Europe, for instance, it is argued that it is easy to consider that fertility levels in Europe will remain below replacement level, but a lot depends on perceptions of people with regard to having children in relation to life goals. According to Vandika, revolution, as Landry used, may be better suited to naming the end state, implying uncertain outcomes that will only be known in time. Further, Nordic countries are still experiencing change, where women at older ages, couples in second unions, single mothers, and others are having a significant number of children. As a result, fertility levels may come close to replacement levels, so population decline would not be significant. If this is so, then lowest low fertility may indicate that a society is not adequately along the path of demographic transition, assuming that every country is following a particular path of demographic development, also accounting for changes created by the framework itself. It was considered to be typical only to northwestern Europe and those places with mainly European origin populations, as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are not expected to spread into the other parts of Europe and not at all to places in Latin America or Asia. Vandeka's sequence of stages was found to be relevant to the European situation at the time, while countries with below replacement fertility levels in Asia, Central America, and Latin America were seen to have common underlying trends with different changes of sequence of reproductive behavior. He argued that universally it was also uncertain for the first demographic transition, although evidence points that way, and it is unlikely that behavioral options would be similar if the conditions population faced were similar, although it is still to be determined. Lesteke argued that it crossed into Central and Eastern Europe, which saw a rise in extramarital births, indicating new procreation patterns. Profiles of individual values by living arrangements were found to be similar across Europe. And among the more industrialized countries in Asia, characteristics match expect for procreation among cohabitants. Out of the little available micro-level data for Japan, Singapore, and South Korea, patterns were also seen to be similar to European countries. Furthermore, it is to be discussed that role of the mass media in creating a world culture related to the beginning of the second demographic transition, the difficulties in separating structural factors from ideational factors with regard to marriage postponement and low fertility. There is difficulty even for the first demographic transition. Backlashes to these changes are possible, but are not seen to be strong enough to reverse trends. Also, paths of development of the second demographic transition are seen to be varied, with numerous historical and cultural factors but a few predictions of the second demographic transition are still valid as detailed in Lesterge's article. What are the alternative explanations for this phenomena? Other possible explanations for the observed changes may be, for instance, by giving an example, in Japan, fewer and more delayed marriages after the Second World War due to measures to control fertility, while cohabitation and fertility outside of marriage were as rare as before, as a non-cohabitating relationship was found to be more suitable to Japanese women than the unattractive option of marriage under conditions at the time. In the case of Eastern Europe, political changes at the end of 1980s, sudden fall in fertility levels for which primary explanations offered were economical and ideational. Also, there was a lack of continuity, orderliness, anomie alongside insecure conditions that exacerbated economic hardship. In this regard, a hypothesis also is proposed that increases in cohabitation before marriage and decline in marriage are related to poverty than cultural and ideational changes. Example in this regard is increased cohabitation in Russia and much of the Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s due to the crisis, unlike Northern and Western Europe, which were cultural shifts. However, argued that crisis played a role in postponement of marriages and births and in bringing about very low levels of fertility, but alone they cannot serve as an explanation. Examples of countries which have post-crisis experience are the GDP per capita rose to very high levels, not accompanied by earlier aged marriage or higher fertility levels. Instead, increased procreation and extramarital births, so additional factors are to be looked for this situation. There are other structural and cultural factors also to be noted. Expanding female education that contributes to postponement of marriage and births, alongside increasing individual autonomy and freedom of choice, which has legitimized alternative living arrangements in a short span of time. These features, lest they argues, cannot be reversed easily. Alternative explanation for below replacement fertility levels deserves our explanation. Importance of sexual relations. If there were to become more equal, fertility levels would go back to previously high levels. This implies that the second demographic transition with low fertility would be a transient stage. Also, the view that improvements in Human Development Index would cause fertility to rise in the industrialized countries. There are certain specificity of predictions in this context. This second demographic transition considered a useful umbrella concept for a broad array of related changes in the realms of sexuality, family, partnership, behaviors and attitudes, and postponement of parenthood. Diverse economic and social contexts, but they are powerful narrative shares of paths of family and reproduction in countries within Europe evolved in the previous 40 years. But problematic as a scientific theory, in this regard, some of the points that needs a discussion, for instance, good on general terms such as predicting trends in family and fertility behavior in Eastern Europe post 1989 after the establishment of democracy and market capitalism, but is vague. Although difficulties in building any theory for accurate, precise predictions of which behavioral changes will take place under what conditions, given historically specific circumstances, context-specific institutions, and the many interactions between changes of ideas and behaviors. Further research is needed to identify the primary structural and cultural factors in different regions for more specificity with regard to the second demographic transition and changes in behavior across different groups. The second demographic transition has given rise to many general theories which can be looked at together to construct a more holistic theory. Further, to include from within the local settings of the social realm and also different influences on individuals, decision-making process of individuals with regard to significant life transitions. The other issue which has to be discussed is that they are not really demographic. For instance, unlike the first demographic transition, which concerned all aspects of demographic systems except for marriage and households in Europe, the second demographic transition does not really address demographic issues, for instance, births and deaths, factors determining population and its characteristics. The second demographic transition is related to marriage and its alternatives as concerning sexual relations, living arrangements, and morals. It is argued that while fertility and marriage is related, they were at least slightly separated in the late 19th century due to the contraceptive revolution and thereby less relevant to population matters. It is also argued that sexual relations are also central to sociology and not so relevant to birth rates as such. The second demographic transition also does not touch upon mortality and the growth, decline or aging of populations as does the first demographic transition, nor is it relevant to process of migration, internal or international. Therefore, it is argued that the second demographic transition observations, while important, need not be considered at par with the first demographic transition in terms of the expanse of the demographic changes occurring in the society. The issue of sustainability. It is argued that transition implies sustainability. The second demographic transition highlights ideational changes that are brought about through economic advances, leading to questions regarding whether the changes are irreversible without regard to the material standards that made it possible in the first place, as well as the effects of these changes if realized. Examples in this context are wealth in Europe influenced the welfare state and social housing, which thereby affected choice of living arrangements, but many of the welfare programs are changing and therefore changes in living arrangements may not be sustained, and that high divorce rates and single parenthood in some welfare states shifts costs into taxpayers which may not be sustainable over time. Single parenting seem to be a potentially effect of teenage births, which in turn has its effects on children, striking in countries such as United States and United Kingdom. Also questioned is whether modern economies can afford the costs of the second demographic transition, just as there is a population aging, a permanent feature which is slowing down economic growth and which cannot be avoided. The issue is again on focus on fertility. It's argued that second demographic transition started out by connecting lowest low fertility to taste, but lowest low fertility is not new except for some regions in Europe. For instance, Western Europe in the 1930s as well as other developed countries in the world had fertility levels below replacement level and the problematic issues, and most analysis used data post 1960s. This depicts a downward fall in fertility levels alongside the second demographic transition, when actually the decline had started much earlier. Also argued that there is no relation across countries between low fertility and the second demographic transition against the empirical and theoretical expectations. Populations in the developed world favoring non-traditional living arrangements tend to have the highest fertility, while populations with very low fertility tend to be those populations where there is a continuous of more traditional attitudes. Also less easily evident a correlation between the second demographic transition and increasing birth rates in several countries in Western Europe. And like the FTD, too emphatic considering changes in reproductive behavior is predictable and irreversible. Lowest fertility levels are also seen as a transition due to the ongoing gender transition. It also points out that Scandinavian countries with more egalitarian gender structures have been able to stabilize fertility levels more so than other countries. The problematic underlying theory, the second demographic transition's underlying theory, the England concept of post-materialism, it is argued to be weak although popularly used in the social sciences. The reasons being, the English short questionnaire does not include gender equity, one of the most important factors in recent demographic and social change, particularly with regard to low fertility. Also, empirical correlations to the scale are also not striking. Economic and other such models considered potentially more useful in explaining recent trends. The concepts of modernization. It is argued difficult to disagree that modernization has had an overpowering impact on social behaviors, that modernism is turning into postmodernism, which has different results. Looking into further, the second demographic transition sees modernization as branching out from few countries to larger areas, but Michael seems demographic practices are located within particular areas. Better conception is a process that comes together, increasingly secular, has multiple poles, and that further already existing practices within their local spaces. Therefore, contemporary fertility scenario needs to be looked at anthropologically rather than asking a misdirected question of whether it is converging or diverging. Reasons are interrelated factors of structure, rational choice, practices and norms in the particular setting. Change from modernism to postmodernism is a change in beliefs and values more than a cognitive dimension, can instead be seen as a new emerging state of mind. A new phase of modernity, a change of moods where individualization and self-realization are beginning to come out, influencing expectations within larger societal framework, and also the gap between expectation and actual behavior without excluding structural factors. Therefore, argues for a more encompassing and global sense to understanding global changes. Issues related to norms and attitudes in this regard are also important for us to discuss in this context. Furthermore, it is important, for instance, more work on the importance of norms and attitudes in influencing demographic changes, structural factors such as economic and political forces. It also highlighted that values are dependent on the contemporary economic, political, demographic context and changes in relation to it. Context-specific studies of fertility, it highlights that motherhood, parenthood, childhood and adolescence as important aspects of child-rearing cause, constantly changing in meaning. Perhaps adds further fatherhood as the second demographic transition features such as increases in divorce and cohabitation have made father-child relations more complex than before. There is a need that for better data and alternate data sources as data used in existing studies are more problematic. In conclusion, we need to see that both first and second demographic transitions have brought out several issues that require for us to have a deeper understanding of the dynamics that exist in fertility, mortality and migration, and also it is with respect to socio-cultural context we need to understand and how over a period of time some of the societies have made its changes in the population transition from high fertility and mortality to low fertility and mortality, and the role of other factors needs our special attention in this regard.